When I tell you that the very first morning after I moved into my lakefront cabin I opened the door to find a crowd of furious strangers waving papers in the air and shouting that the entire estate belonged to them, you might think I'm exaggerating, but that is exactly how it happened, and the sheer absurdity of it all was only matched by the fact that I had barely unpacked my coffee mugs. The hook of the whole ordeal hit me like a slap, because before I even had a chance to savor the sunrise glistening across the water or admire how the mist hovered above the calm lake, I was being screamed at by a pack of self-important people who introduced themselves not as neighbors, not as a welcome committee, but as the HOA, and they declared with puffed chests that my home, my porch, and even the view I was looking at now belonged under their control. I stood there stunned, coffee cup in hand, wondering if I had somehow wandered into the wrong story, because instead of handshakes and pies it was legal threats, absurd demands, and the announcement that I was trespassing on my own deeded land, a claim so laughable that I almost spilled my drink in disbelief. That shocking intrusion set the stage for everything that followed, and even as the sun rose higher the storm clouds in the form of these HOA zealots began to gather, promising conflict, drama, and a showdown that none of them expected to lose but which I had already decided I would not back down from. The day before had been peaceful, almost deceptively so. I had pulled up my truck after the long drive and unloaded the last of my boxes, relishing the idea that I finally had my own place by the lake, a dream that had seemed out of reach for years. The cabin was modest but strong, built with thick logs and a broad porch that looked directly out over the shimmering water. I imagined long evenings sitting there with a fishing pole or mornings with a steaming mug, watching the birds glide across the surface. The realtor had told me there might be some strong personalities in the area, but I figured every neighborhood had its quirks. What I hadn't expected was that my very first interaction would be less about friendly introductions and more about a hostile takeover attempt. They came as a group, nearly a dozen of them, marching up my gravel drive as if they owned the ground they walked on, each one dressed in varying shades of casual but carrying the same smug air of authority. At the front was a woman who immediately started speaking over everyone else, barking like a general leading troops into battle. She introduced herself as the president of the HOA, though she didn't bother to say her name until I asked. Her voice was sharp, carrying across the porch as she waved a clipboard full of papers, claiming they had bylaws that dictated who could live where, what could be built, and even what hours one could use the lake. I listened for a moment, half thinking this was some elaborate prank, until she jabbed a finger toward me and announced that my ownership was invalid because I had not submitted myself for approval by their board. It was almost comical, the way she tried to project power, as though a handful of neighbors in matching polo shirts could outmuscle the fact that I held a notarized deed and had wired an obscene amount of money to secure this place legally. I let her finish her tirade before calmly walking back inside, grabbing the manila folder with every piece of paperwork, and laying it on the porch rail like a poker player revealing a royal flush. Her eyes flickered for the briefest moment, betraying doubt, but she recovered quickly, claiming that no matter what the papers said, the HOA still had jurisdiction and could fine me or even force me to vacate. That was the moment I realized these people weren't just bluffing for sport. They truly believed they could scare me into submission, and that made them dangerous in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Behind her, the others began to chime in, each with their own ridiculous claims. One man insisted that my dock was technically part of the HOA marina and therefore subject to their fees. Another said my truck was parked at the wrong angle according to neighborhood aesthetic. Someone else muttered that my porch light was too bright, even though I hadn't even turned it on yet. Each complaint grew more absurd, until the scene felt like a comedy sketch rather than a real dispute, but the sheer volume of voices made it clear they had rehearsed this assault. They wanted to overwhelm me, to crush me with noise, paperwork, and fabricated rules until I bent. Instead, I let them rant and rave until their energy began to sputter, then I leaned against the porch post and asked one simple question. Who exactly do you think owns this land? The silence that followed was telling. They looked around at each other, unsure who should answer, until the president spoke again, claiming that technically the HOA had first rights to approve new owners and that I must have slipped through a crack. Her confidence wavered when I explained that not only had the county clerk stamped my purchase, but the previous owner had explicitly removed the property from the HOA covenants years ago after a lengthy legal battle. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized the implications, but she tried to mask it with another tirade, threatening to take me to court, to call the sheriff, to have me arrested for trespassing. That last part nearly made me laugh out loud, because what she didn't know was that I had already spoken with the sheriff myself the day before, ensuring there would be no disputes over my rights. The sheriff had chuckled when I explained who I was buying from and warned me that the HOA was notorious for overreaching, but he assured me that the law was firmly on my side. With that knowledge in my pocket, I wasn't scared, just annoyed. I told them plainly that unless they had legitimate legal documents signed by a judge, they had no authority to tell me anything about my home, my land, or my lake. The look on their faces was priceless, a mixture of indignation, disbelief, and barely suppressed panic. They weren't used to resistance, clearly. They expected a newcomer to bow, to panic, to grovel for acceptance. Instead, they got a man who had already prepared for their nonsense and wasn't about to let a gaggle of power-hungry neighbors dictate his life. Some of them began to mutter, questioning whether they should really push this, but the president wasn't ready to concede. She declared that they would be back with reinforcements, that this wasn't over, and that I had no idea who I was messing with. Then she spun on her heel, leading the group back down my driveway like a retreating army vowing to return. As they disappeared down the road, I finally exhaled the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The lake glistened behind me, calm and steady, the complete opposite of the storm I had just endured. I sipped the last of my now lukewarm coffee, shaking my head at the insanity of it all. It was only the first morning, and already the HOA had declared war on me. Yet instead of fear, I felt a strange exhilaration. They thought they could bully me, but they had no idea that I was not only ready for them but more than capable of turning their little game inside out. And so the first shots of the battle had been fired, not with weapons but with words, threats, and paperwork, and though they walked away thinking they would crush me, I stood on my porch knowing deep down that this was only the beginning of a much bigger war, one where I had more surprises waiting for them than they could possibly imagine. The second day dawned with an eerie stillness that felt almost deceptive, as if the lake itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the chaos that was sure to return. The glassy water reflected the sky in a way that made it look like the world was split in two, one calm and beautiful above, and one uncertain and tense below. I brewed my coffee again and sat on the porch, determined not to let the absurdity of the previous day steal the peace I had come here for, but even as I sipped the steaming drink I knew that peace would not last. The HOA had retreated, but they had promised to come back with reinforcements, and if there was one thing I had learned from watching people like that, it was that they thrived on conflict and never admitted defeat. My truck was still parked in the same spot, my boxes still only half unpacked, but already I felt as if I were settling into a battle camp rather than a home. Sure enough, before the sun had fully risen over the tree line, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. At first I thought maybe it was a neighbor coming by to actually introduce themselves in a normal way, but my hope was dashed when I saw the same pack of polo shirt warriors marching up my driveway, only this time they had doubled their numbers and brought along clipboards, cameras, and even what looked like a cheap bullhorn. The president of the HOA, the same woman who had screamed at me yesterday, stood at the front again with a look of grim determination. Her eyes met mine across the yard as if she were preparing for a duel, and behind her the rest of the group fanned out like soldiers ready to storm a castle. It would have been intimidating if it weren't so ridiculous, and I almost laughed again when I noticed one man carrying a tape measure like he was about to inspect every blade of grass for regulation height. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. The bullhorn crackled to life, screeching with feedback before the president's shrill voice declared that I was in violation of multiple neighborhood bylaws and that I had 24 hours to vacate the premises or face escalating fines and legal action. The audacity of it all was breathtaking. I didn't even stand yet, just leaned back in my chair with my coffee and asked loudly if they had brought a judge this time or if this was just more theater. My calmness seemed to infuriate them more than anything, because instead of rattling me, their show of force looked childish and desperate. A few of the newer members of the mob glanced at each other uncertainly, clearly not expecting such resistance so early in their campaign. Then the tape measure man stepped forward, announcing that he was going to inspect my dock for safety hazard. I told him flatly to stay off my property unless he had a warrant, and when he hesitated I added that I had already spoken with the sheriff, who was more than aware of their antics. That stopped him cold, but the president barked at him to continue anyway. He lifted the tape measure, took a dramatic step forward, and froze when I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out my phone, pretending to dial. I didn't even have to say a word. The implication was enough. He backed off quickly, muttering something about me being unreasonable, and slunk back into the group. The president tried to rally her forces, shouting that this was an official HOA inspection, but the cracks in her authority were beginning to show. Some of the people in the back were whispering, looking around nervously as though they realized they might be trespassing. I seized the opportunity and laid the manila folder of documents on the porch rail again, raising my voice so all of them could hear as I read out loud the county's declaration that my property was legally exempt from their HOA covenants. The words echoed across the yard, and I could see the shift in the crowd immediately. Some grew pale, some folded their arms defensively, but a few actually looked angry at the president, as if realizing she had misled them. That was when the shouting began, louder and messier than before, but this time it wasn't just directed at me. Several members of the group started arguing among themselves, questioning whether they should even be there. One man pointed out that if the sheriff had really confirmed my independence from the HOA, then they were wasting their time and risking legal trouble themselves. Another woman accused the president of dragging them into personal vendettas rather than legitimate HOA business. The president, however, doubled down, raising her bullhorn again and screaming that if they let me stay, it would undermine everything they had built, that my independence would set a dangerous precedent. She looked more desperate than authoritative now, her mask slipping in front of her own people. I watched it all unfold with the detached amusement of someone who knew he held all the cards. Every time they shouted, I stayed calm. Every time they tried to threaten, I countered with facts. Their noise and numbers meant nothing without the law on their side, and I had already secured that advantage. Finally, when the chaos reached a fever pitch, I stood up, walked down the steps slowly, and told them all to listen closely. I explained again that my property had been legally severed from their association, that they had no jurisdiction here, and that any further attempts to harass me would be recorded and forwarded to the sheriff's office. I said it with a steady voice, not angry but firm, and for the first time the crowd actually went quiet. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of the lake lapping gently against the shore, a contrast so sharp it almost felt poetic. The president looked at me with pure venom, her jaw tight, her hands trembling slightly as she held the bullhorn. She tried one last desperate move, shouting that they would sue me and that I would regret ever moving here, but even her own people seemed less convinced now. A few shook their heads and began walking back toward their cars. The group was crumbling, the illusion of power dissolving in the face of calm resistance. As they retreated, their numbers smaller than when they arrived, I couldn't help but feel both relieved and exhilarated. They had come at me twice now, each time with greater bluster, and both times I had held my ground without so much as breaking a sweat. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. The president's fury was too raw, her pride too wounded to simply let this go. She would be back, and next time she might not rely on paperwork and shouting alone. That realization made my pulse quicken, not with fear but with anticipation. If she wanted war, she would get it, but it would be on my terms, and I had plenty of surprises she couldn't even imagine. That night, as the sun sank low and painted the lake with streaks of orange and purple, I sat on the porch again, reflecting on how quickly my dream of quiet lakefront living had transformed into a battlefield. Yet somehow, in the strange twists of fate, I felt alive, as though this conflict was a challenge I was meant to face. The lake whispered promises of peace, but the land carried the echoes of war drums, and I was ready for both. The HOA had stormed in twice already, and each time they left weaker than before. I had no doubt they would return, but now I was certain of one thing above all else. This was my land, my home, my lakefront estate, and no amount of bluster from power-hungry neighbors was ever going to change that. The third day began with a sense of eerie anticipation that hung heavy in the air, as though the lake and trees around me knew that another storm was brewing even before I did. I tried to start the morning like any other, boiling water for coffee, stepping onto the porch with the intention of enjoying the calm ripples that stretched across the lake, but there was an unease that I could not shake. The encounters with the HOA in the first 2 days had already left a mark, not in fear but in heightened awareness, sharpening my instincts. I knew they were not done. I knew the president in particular could not stomach being humiliated twice in front of her followers, and I was almost certain she would double down with something more theatrical, something that she hoped would break me or at least tilt the balance of perception back in her favor. When the first sounds reached my ears, I realized I was right, for instead of the crunch of gravel under shoes or the slow roll of cars, what I heard was a rumbling engine, a deliberate show of noise and power meant to announce their presence before they even came into sight. The sound grew louder until, to my disbelief, a convoy of golf carts and SUVs rolled down the road toward my cabin, looking more like a parade than a neighborhood committee. They had banners taped to the sides of some carts, hastily scribbled slogans about protecting the community and upholding HOA authority. One of them even had a whistle, blowing in shrill bursts as if trying to corral cattle rather than approach a fellow homeowner. At the front once again was the president, standing tall in the passenger seat of a cart, holding the bullhorn like a scepter. Behind her trailed nearly 20 people this time, some familiar faces from the first 2 encounters and others clearly dragged in to boost numbers. They formed a semicircle in front of my property, blocking the drive as if staging a siege. The sheer absurdity of it made me wonder if I should pop popcorn before responding, because it was turning into a live-action sitcom staged on my front lawn. The president wasted no time firing up her bullhorn, declaring in a voice that cracked with both volume and desperation that my continued occupation of the lakefront property was an act of defiance against the community, that I was in violation of rules so sacred they might as well have been carved in stone, and that unless I surrendered my deed and submitted to their bylaws, they would impose collective sanctions against me. I could barely contain my laughter at the phrase, because the idea of a homeowners association imposing sanctions like some rogue nation at the United Nations was beyond parody. Yet the mob cheered behind her, banging on clipboards, waving flags, and chanting slogans that she had clearly rehearsed with them. It was no longer just a confrontation. It was a full-blown spectacle, and the fact that they thought this would intimidate me only made the scene more tragicomic. I let her rant for a while, sipping my coffee, before finally walking to the edge of the porch and addressing them in a calm but loud enough voice that carried over the chants. I reminded them once again that my deed was legally binding, that my property had been severed from their covenants, and that their repeated harassment was not only baseless but actionable. This only stoked their outrage, and they began shouting over one another with accusations ranging from absurd claims that my house had been built on land zoned for community use to the bizarre suggestion that I was illegally siphoning lake water from everyone else. One man actually waved a plastic bottle in the air, shouting that he had proof my well was contaminating the lake, even though I had only just moved in and hadn't even set up the filtration system yet. Their arguments became so ridiculous that I couldn't help but challenge them directly. I told the man with the bottle to hand it over if he truly had evidence. He faltered, his bravado slipping as he admitted it was just water he had scooped from the lake itself. The crowd laughed awkwardly, and the president quickly tried to redirect attention, yelling through her bullhorn that I was mocking the community. That was the moment I decided to turn the tables, not by shouting louder or threatening back, but by exposing their game for what it was. I walked back into the cabin, retrieved the stack of official documents once more, and returned with them in hand. But this time I didn't just hold them up. I laid them out on a small folding table I set on the porch, inviting anyone brave enough to come forward and examine them themselves. There was hesitation in the crowd. Some craned their necks, clearly curious, but none dared step out of line, afraid to contradict their president's narrative. Finally, one older man, who had remained quiet during the previous confrontations, stepped forward slowly. His expression wasn't angry but weary, the look of someone dragged into something he didn't truly believe in. He approached the table cautiously, picked up one of the documents, and began to read. The silence that followed was telling, because his eyebrows lifted, his mouth tightened, and then he looked back at the others with a simple but devastating statement: "It's legitimate." That one phrase rippled through the crowd like a stone tossed into still water. Murmurs erupted, eyes darted to the president, and the fragile unity she had built began to crack. Her face flushed red, and she tried to shout him down, accusing him of being misled, claiming the documents were forged, but the damage was done. Others started questioning her directly, asking why she hadn't mentioned that the property had been exempted years ago, why she had dragged them into this conflict if the legal footing was shaky. The spectacle she had built was unraveling before her eyes, and for a moment I thought she might crumble entirely. But instead she doubled down, her voice trembling with rage as she declared that even if the law technically sided with me, the community itself would never accept my independence. She warned me that isolation was a dangerous path, that I would be cut off from amenities, excluded from events, and treated as an outsider until I gave in. Her words might have carried weight if I had moved here for social gatherings or neighborhood approval, but I hadn't come for barbecues and bingo night. I had come for peace, for the lake, for the freedom of owning something that was mine alone. So I told her plainly that I had no interest in their events, no need for their amenities, and that if exclusion was the worst weapon they had, then they had already lost. My calm dismissal only enraged her further, and she resorted to threats again, promising legal action and consequences that she could never truly deliver. The crowd, however, seemed less and less convinced, their chants fading, their flags lowering, their energy draining like air from a punctured balloon. Eventually, they dispersed once more, their departure less dramatic than their arrival, the convoy of golf carts rolling away without fanfare. The president lingered for a moment, glaring at me with a venom that promised retaliation, before she too turned and left. I watched them go, feeling the adrenaline in my veins slowly subside, replaced with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The war was far from over, but the cracks in their unity were widening, and I had no doubt that the more she pushed, the more her followers would question her authority. That night I sat by the lake, the water shimmering under the moonlight, and considered the strange battle I had been thrust into. It wasn't just about property lines or bylaws anymore. It had become a clash of wills, a test of who could endure longer, who could stand taller when pushed. I knew she would come back again, perhaps with new tricks, perhaps with legal papers or fabricated charges, but I also knew that every confrontation left her weaker than before, every outburst revealed more of her desperation. What she didn't understand was that this wasn't just about winning a fight for me, it was about principle, about proving that no self-appointed tyrant could steal what was rightfully mine. The lake whispered softly in the background, steady and eternal, reminding me that while people came and went with their chaos, the land remained, and I would remain with it, unshaken and unbroken. By the fourth day I had started to realize that what was happening was no longer just an annoying string of confrontations but a full-scale campaign orchestrated by a desperate president who could not stand the idea that her power had boundaries. The lake remained calm, the sun painted the horizon with the same golden hues, the air smelled of pine and water, but beneath that serene surface there was tension humming like an electric current. I woke up early, walked down to the dock with my fishing pole, and tried to distract myself with the thought of pulling a bass from the water. Yet even as I watched the line float lazily in the ripples, I could not shake the sense that today would be another escalation. I had underestimated their audacity before, but after the spectacle with the golf carts and banners I knew they would try to up the ante again, this time perhaps with something they believed would truly frighten me. My hunch was confirmed when I heard not just cars but a flatbed truck rolling down the gravel road, carrying something bulky beneath a tarp. The convoy arrived in the late morning, and when I walked back up the dock toward my cabin I saw that they had not only returned with a larger group, but with props that looked like they belonged more in a county fair than a neighborhood dispute. The flatbed stopped in front of my driveway, and with a flourish the president pulled the tarp off to reveal a giant wooden sign painted with bold letters that read HOA property trespassers will be fined. The absurdity of the sign was matched only by the way they began hammering it into the ground at the edge of my driveway, as though claiming dominion over my land by staking it like some medieval banner. Behind them others carried folding chairs, coolers, and cameras, setting up what looked like an encampment right there in front of my property, as if they planned to outlast me by sheer presence. It wasn't just a visit anymore, it was a siege, a calculated attempt to make my life unbearable until I submitted. I stood on the porch silently at first, watching the theater unfold. They clearly expected me to storm down and argue, to shout or to try to rip the sign out of the ground. Instead I let them finish their performance, let the cameras record the ridiculousness of it all, before I calmly walked inside and dialed the sheriff. He answered with a laugh when I explained the scene, promising to send someone out immediately. The knowledge that I had the law on my side gave me the strength to remain calm, and I decided that if they wanted a show, then I would give them one, but it would not be the show they expected. When I stepped back outside, I called out to the crowd and asked loudly if they had finally brought any legal documentation to support their claims. The president, standing proudly beside the ridiculous sign, raised her bullhorn and declared that the sign itself was documentation enough, that the community had voted unanimously to reclaim the property. The crowd cheered, but the cracks in their enthusiasm were visible even from where I stood. Some clapped half-heartedly, others looked uneasy, and a few shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs as though realizing the farce of it all. I pressed harder, asking if they were prepared to explain to the sheriff why they were trespassing and attempting to stake a false claim on land clearly marked under my deed. That caused another ripple of unease, and I could see the president falter for just a moment before regaining her bluster. The sheriff's deputy arrived faster than I expected, pulling up in a patrol car that cut through the crowd like a blade. The murmurs quieted as the deputy stepped out, a tall man with a calm presence who looked as though he had dealt with this nonsense before. He walked up to me first, shook my hand, and asked to see the document. I handed him the folder, which he examined briefly before nodding and turning toward the crowd. In a steady voice he announced that my property was indeed exempt from the HOA, that their sign was illegal, and that if they did not remove themselves immediately they could be cited for trespassing. The look on the president's face was priceless, a mixture of rage and disbelief, as though her entire empire had just been undermined in front of her loyal followers. She tried to argue, waving her bullhorn and insisting that the deputy didn't understand the bylaws, but he cut her off sharply, reminding her that county law superseded any neighborhood rules and that she was already towing the line of harassment. The authority in his voice silenced the crowd, and slowly, reluctantly, they began dismantling their little encampment. The sign was pulled from the ground, the chairs folded, the coolers packed away, and one by one they retreated once again, muttering angrily but powerless to resist. I thanked the deputy, who chuckled and warned me again that they were relentless, that this likely wouldn't be the last time I'd have to call. He drove off, leaving me once more in the silence of victory, though I knew deep down it was only a temporary reprieve. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip low across the water, I reflected on how quickly the situation had escalated. It wasn't about property anymore, not really. For the president, this had become personal, a battle of pride and control, and for me it had become a matter of principle. She had thrown 3 different assaults at me now, each more desperate than the last, and each time I had not only resisted but turned her aggression back against her. Yet I could not ignore the gnawing thought that she would not stop until she found some weapon I hadn't anticipated. She was already humiliated publicly, already questioned by her own followers, and that kind of desperation could lead to reckless choices. I knew I had to be ready, not just with paperwork and patience, but with a strategy that would protect me from whatever storm she conjured next. The lake shimmered under the last light of dusk, calm and unwavering, a mirror to the determination I felt inside. The HOA had come at me 3 times and failed 3 times, but I had no illusions that the battle was over. This was not just about a cabin or a patch of land. It was about standing up to people who thrived on intimidation and control, people who believed that rules they invented could trump the law itself. I had chosen this place for its peace, but if it meant defending that peace with every ounce of strength and wit I had, then I was more than ready. The 4th day ended not with fear but with resolve, and as the stars emerged over the water, I promised myself that no matter how absurd or outrageous their next move would be, I would face it head-on and remind them again and again that this land was mine, and no sign, no bullhorn, no mob could ever change that fact. On the 5th day the air felt heavier, not because of the weather but because of the tension that lingered like a storm cloud refusing to move on. I woke before dawn, restless from the knowledge that the HOA president would not allow her humiliation from the day before to sit quietly. People like her did not accept defeat, they nursed it, twisted it, and let it fuel their next move. I brewed my coffee and stood on the porch, scanning the road out of habit, half expecting to see headlights creeping through the trees. The lake remained calm, the mist rising lazily off its surface, but I knew better than to be lulled by its serenity. The last 4 encounters had taught me that she thrived on drama, and I suspected her next act would be the boldest yet. I was not wrong, because before the sun had fully climbed the horizon I heard the sound of multiple engines, not just 1 or 2 vehicles but several, coming together like a caravan. When they appeared this time, it was not with golf carts or homemade signs, but with something more formal. A group of them stepped out of SUVs dressed not in polo shirts or casual outfits but in suits and business attire, clutching clipboards, folders, and briefcases. They looked like they were staging a courtroom on my driveway, and in a way that was exactly what they were doing. The president walked at the center of the group, her chin raised high, carrying a large binder thick with papers. She announced loudly that they were convening an emergency HOA tribunal to address my defiance, and that I was required to attend. The sheer ridiculousness of the announcement almost made me laugh, but the way the others flanked her, setting up folding tables, chairs, and even a microphone system plugged into a portable speaker, showed they were deadly serious about the charade. I stayed on the porch, arms crossed, watching as they arranged themselves into what looked like a makeshift courtroom right at the edge of my driveway. The president sat in the center like a judge, with her followers positioned on either side like jurors, and one man even wore a tie with a cheap badge pinned to his shirt, pretending to be some sort of officer of the court. They summoned me again, demanding I step down and face their charges, listing them in a booming voice for the benefit of the onlookers they had dragged with them. They accused me of trespassing, of damaging community property, of threatening HOA members, and of disrupting community harmony. Each charge was more fabricated than the last, but they spoke with the confidence of actors who had rehearsed their lines, clearly hoping to intimidate me with the sheer weight of their performance. I let them finish their pageantry before answering, my voice calm but cutting through their noise. I told them that their so-called tribunal held no legal weight, that their accusations were baseless, and that if they truly believed I had broken the law, they were welcome to file a case with the county court like anyone else. My refusal to play along rattled them, but the president quickly tried to recover, insisting that their tribunal was binding for all community members. She waved her thick binder of bylaws dramatically, claiming it gave them authority to evict me. I stepped inside, returned with my folder of legal documents yet again, and raised them high for all to see, reminding them that my property had been legally exempt from their authority for years, and that their attempts to override that were nothing short of harassment. The tension thickened as her supporters began to exchange nervous glances. Some scribbled notes furiously as though trying to keep up with the farce, while others looked visibly uncomfortable, realizing how absurd it was. The president pounded her fist on the table, declaring me guilty by unanimous vote, and her so-called jurors clapped half-heartedly as if trying to convince themselves of the verdict. I smiled and told them to enjoy their little play because the sheriff would be very interested in hearing about this. That was when I pulled out my phone, dialed the sheriff's office right there in front of them, and put the call on speaker. The deputy I had spoken with before answered, and I calmly explained the situation. The crowd fell silent as his voice came through, firm and steady, declaring that their tribunal was meaningless, that they had no legal standing over my property, and that if they continued to harass me I could press charges. The silence after his words was deafening. The president tried to shout back into the phone, but the deputy cut her off sharply, warning her that she was already treading dangerously close to criminal behavior. The color drained from her face, and for the first time since this feud had begun, she was visibly shaken. Her supporters sat awkwardly in their folding chairs, unsure whether to side with her or retreat. One man in the back muttered that this was going too far, and soon others followed, voicing doubts, questioning why they were wasting their time on something that clearly had no chance of succeeding. The spectacle she had orchestrated to display her power was unraveling right before her eyes, and her attempts to regain control grew more frantic, her voice rising in pitch until it cracked. I ended the call, put my phone away, and told them all plainly that this was the last time I would tolerate their harassment. I warned that if they returned without legitimate legal grounds, I would not only involve the sheriff again but also explore legal action of my own for harassment and trespassing. My words carried a finality that silenced even the most loyal among them. Slowly, one by one, they began packing up their so-called courtroom, folding chairs clattering as they loaded them back into SUVs. The microphone system was dismantled, the tables shoved back into trunks, and with each piece of their false authority removed, their confidence drained further. Finally, the president herself, red-faced and trembling with fury, was left standing alone by her binder. She clutched it like a lifeline, glaring at me with pure venom, before storming off into her vehicle and slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. As the convoy retreated down the road, I stood on my porch feeling not just relief but a new sense of victory. They had escalated to their most elaborate stunt yet, and I had dismantled it with calm, patience, and the law on my side. Yet I knew this was not the end. The president's pride had been shattered again, and humiliation in front of her followers was not something she would let slide quietly. She had tried intimidation, spectacle, even mock trials, and each time she had failed. That meant her next move would be even more desperate, perhaps reckless, and though I felt strong in my victories, I could not let my guard down. That night the lake was quieter than usual, as though it too had absorbed the tension of the day. The moon hung low, casting silver ripples across the water, and I sat on the dock reflecting on how bizarre my life had become in such a short span of time. I had come here for peace, for solitude, for a dream I had worked years to achieve, and instead I found myself locked in a war of wills with a woman who could not accept boundaries. But despite the chaos, I felt more determined than ever. She had underestimated me every step of the way, assuming I would cave like others before me, and with each attempt she only revealed her weakness. I knew the final confrontation was coming, one that would decide once and for all whether she would finally back down or destroy herself trying. And as I sat there listening to the gentle lapping of the water, I realized I was ready for it, no matter how dramatic or outrageous it turned out to be. By the 6th day the war had reached a point where it was impossible to imagine any kind of quiet resolution. The air itself seemed charged. The mornings no longer felt like moments of peace but like calm before a storm. I slept lightly that night, half expecting headlights to sweep across the walls or the sound of shouting to break the silence. When dawn finally crept across the lake, I rose with a strange certainty that today would be the climax of it all, the final attempt by the HOA president to reassert herself. I went through my routine as calmly as I could, brewing my coffee, walking the perimeter of the property, checking my dock and the boundaries of my land. Everything was in order, but I felt like a soldier preparing for battle. It wasn't paranoia, it was inevitability, and when I heard the low growl of multiple engines approaching together, I knew my instincts had been right. The convoy that appeared this time was larger than ever before, not just SUVs and golf carts but pickup trucks with trailers attached, loaded with equipment that made my stomach twist with both anger and disbelief. They had come with chains, tools, even what looked like a small bulldozer perched on one trailer, and the sheer audacity of it almost stole my breath away. It was no longer a game of signs and tribunals, this was a direct physical threat, a last-ditch attempt to intimidate me into surrender. The president emerged from the lead vehicle with an expression that was both triumphant and deranged, holding her bullhorn as if it were a crown. She announced with a booming voice that since I had refused to comply with their rulings, the HOA had voted to seize my property by force and demolish any unauthorized structures, including my cabin and dock. The crowd behind her cheered in unison, though their voices wavered, betraying their unease at the sheer illegality of what they were attempting. I stood firm on my porch, staring them down, my calmness masking the fire building inside me. They expected fear, they expected panic, but I gave them neither. Instead, I pulled out my phone once more and called the sheriff directly, explaining in a steady tone that the HOA was now on my property with heavy machinery, threatening destruction. The president tried to shout over me, insisting loudly to her followers that this was community action, not trespassing, but the look on their faces told me they were not convinced. Even the men standing by the bulldozer hesitated, their hands resting on chains they were suddenly unsure about using. When the sirens pierced the air, faint at first but growing louder, the tension snapped like a taut rope. The convoy of HOA members froze, their bluster wilting under the sound of real authority approaching. The sheriff's patrol vehicles rolled up the road, lights flashing against the trees, and stopped with precision that silenced the entire crowd. Officers stepped out with calm but commanding presence, hands resting on their belts, scanning the scene. The sheriff himself emerged from his vehicle, a man with a reputation for patience but also for decisive action when pushed too far. He looked at the bulldozer, at the chains, at the absurd collection of neighbors standing behind their president, and shook his head slowly as though disappointed in children who had gone too far. He walked straight toward me first, asked if I was all right, and then turned on the crowd with a voice that carried more authority than any bullhorn could ever muster. He demanded an explanation for why they were assembled on my land with equipment clearly intended for demolition. The president tried to raise her bullhorn, but the sheriff cut her off sharply, warning her that she was one word away from being arrested for criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and incitement. Her face went pale, her hands trembled, but still she tried to sputter about community rights and bylaws. The sheriff silenced her with a raised hand and told her flatly that her bylaws ended at the boundary of her own property, and that this cabin and the land it sat on were none of her concern. The silence that followed was suffocating. Her supporters shifted nervously, some stepping back, some whispering among themselves about not wanting to be arrested. The men by the bulldozer abandoned their posts, retreating quickly when the sheriff motioned toward them. The president stood alone now, her power evaporating with every second that passed, her desperate attempts to rally her people failing miserably. The sheriff then did what I had been waiting for since this feud began. He told her that enough was enough, that she had harassed me for the last time, and that if she or her followers set foot on my property again without my consent or a legal warrant, she would be facing charges that could strip her of her position and even land her in jail. Her mask cracked completely in that moment. The fury that had carried her through each of her attacks gave way to fear, and though she tried to stand tall, her voice wavered when she shouted that this wasn't over. The sheriff calmly replied that it was over, that her little war had ended the second she thought she could bring machinery onto private land. He told her to pack up her circus and leave before he started writing citations, and with that the last shred of her authority crumbled. The crowd dispersed, quickly and quietly this time, no cheering, no banners, no bluster. They loaded their trucks in silence, avoiding my eyes, avoiding the sheriff's, their loyalty to her broken beyond repair. Even her closest allies abandoned her, climbing into their vehicles without waiting for her orders. She was left alone, standing in the dust, clutching her bullhorn uselessly as if hoping it might still give her the power she had lost. When she finally turned and left, her vehicle sputtering down the road slower than before, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. The sheriff lingered for a moment, reminding me that the law had always been on my side, and that she had finally gone too far to ever try this again. He assured me that a report would be filed, and that, if she attempted anything else, the consequences would be swift and final. We shook hands, and when he left, the silence that settled over the property was not tense this time but liberating. For the first time since I had moved in, I felt that the land was truly mine without the shadow of her presence looming over it. That evening I sat on the dock, watching the sunset bleed across the water in colors so vivid it felt like a reward. The cabin behind me stood unscathed, strong and steady, a testament to resilience in the face of absurdity. The lake reflected the fading light, calm and eternal, and for the first time I allowed myself to relax completely, to believe that the battle had truly ended. I thought back on the madness of the past days, the shouting, the signs, the fake tribunals, the bulldozer, and it all seemed surreal, like a story told to make people laugh and gasp. Yet it had been real, and I had endured it, not just endured but triumphed, proving that no self-appointed tyrant could ever strip away what I had rightfully earned. The war with the HOA had ended not with me surrendering or compromising, but with her overreaching to the point of collapse. She had destroyed her credibility, fractured her support, and shown everyone that her power was nothing more than noise without substance. I had won not by aggression but by patience, by calm defiance, by refusing to bend even when faced with overwhelming pressure. As the last light disappeared and the stars emerged above the lake, I knew that this place was mine at last, truly and fully mine, and that the peace I had come here to find was finally within reach. The land was quiet, the water steady, and for the first time in days I slept deeply, knowing the storm had passed and that no HOA president, no mob, no bulldozer could ever take away the simple truth that the Lakefront estate was mine and always would be.